So this is now the 5th session in our Playbook Masterclass series. We have had an extraordinary series of discussions, really teasing out different elements from the playbook. And I'm delighted to welcome Steve Steinhubble and Sophia Warner today to talk you through specific considerations for remote monitoring in clinical care. Before we dive in and I ask them to introduce themselves, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping for folks who may not have attended a masterclass session before. Just a heads up, we always disclose this, we are recording today's webinar, but what that does mean is both the recording and the slides will be available later, both on playbook.dimesociety.org and on the DIME website. So if you have a colleague who you decide this is a must-see for, this is all available for them. In addition, Sophia and Steve are going to offer some really insightful remarks. They're going to tease out some of the elements from the playbook for you, really think about how we can apply some of those sort of resources to clinical care, but we'll also allocate a lot of time for discussion. And there are a couple of ways that each of you on the line can get involved. At any point during the presentation, you can use either the chat box or the Q&A. Just type in your question. I will see if you can ask those live if you would like, but otherwise I can field them to both Sophia and Steve when we move to discussion. Alternatively, you can look to the participant list, you can raise your hand and virtually, not really like I'm doing, and then I will unmute you and you can pose your questions directly to Sophia and Steve. So with that, I will get out of the way. I will hand over to our two physician experts we have in the house today. Sophia and Steve, I'll let you introduce yourselves and then just call on me when you need me to introduce slides.
Great. Sophia, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I'm Sophia Warner. I'm a physician. And I practice internal medicine at Boston Medical Center, where I also have a role on our population health team as an assistant medical director.
And I'm Steve Steinhubble. I'm the director of digital medicine at Scripps Research Institute, but have a very interesting life split between Anchorage, Alaska, and there. And in Anchorage, Alaska, I am a cardiologist at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium.
Great. So excited to be here with everybody today and talk about applications of remote monitoring in clinical care. And so I thought that we could start off with a case that was also included in the playbook. And I also just wanted to mention that these are just my personal views. These aren't the views of my employer. And so to start off with, I want to talk about a clinical scenario that's pretty common in primary care, which is that I have a lot of patients who have difficulty sleeping. And this is really, not sleeping is a big problem for a lot of people. It impacts their overall quality of life. It can make their other medical conditions worse. It can make it so they don't have energy, to take care of their medical conditions, let alone many other things in their life. And so, and this is an opportunity to think about how we can use remote monitoring in clinical care. I want to think about how I can measure sleep in a meaningful way for my patients and where are some places I can start. So we can move to the next slide. But sleep is a very big term. And I think when we hear a patient say that they're not sleeping well, it's really important to drill down from sleep as a broad concept and think about the measures that could be included when we think about sleep. So when we think about sleep, our patients might be saying they don't sleep well, but that might actually mean something different to different people. So for some people, that means that they're just not, that we want to drill down and think about the different elements of sleep. So one would be duration of rest. What's the patient's total sleep time? What's the total time they spend in their bed? What's their longest sleep period? For some patients, a problem is not just falling asleep, but staying asleep. So we can think about the time that they are waking up after they fall asleep, or how many times that they are waking up, whether they realize it or not, after they fall asleep. And then another issue that a lot of people suffer from is just delayed sleep onset. So how long does it take them to fall asleep? And so, when thinking about these things, it's important to think about what matters to the patient, how we can measure this, and what outcomes we're going to focus on. So we can go to the next slide. And so this is just a framework for thinking about measuring, developing measures that matter to patients. And so we can think about something that matters to the patient, an aspect of a disease that they don't want to become worse, or that they want to improve, or that they want to prevent. And then we translate that into a concept of interest as something that's more simplified or narrower that we can actually measure and tie to a clinical outcome. And there's also an example here for research, but just thinking about clinical care, thinking about a specific outcome. And we'll go through a couple examples on the next slide. And so just to share a couple other examples for other diseases and illnesses, and then we'll go back to sleep. But for example, a Parkinson's patient who has difficulty walking, what might be meaningful to them is to be able to walk so that they can carry their own groceries. So just a walk so they can take a walk outside with a family member. And so then the concept that we'd be interested in that case would be like their level of activity or their walking capacity. And then we could be looking and measuring how many walking episodes they have per day. And then an endpoint could be the percentage of patients who are able to increase their activity. That might be more for a research setting, but that also might be a goal that a specific patient is targeting. And then in the case of something like anxiety, which often, patients who have anxiety can often have trouble sleeping. So to go back to the sleep example, a meaningful aspect of health for a patient could be that they're exhausted, they're having trouble resting and relaxing. And then the concept could be sleep, and specifically sleep duration or sleep onset. And then we can measure those things using remote monitoring and look and see if different interventions have the desired effect and outcome for the specific patient. So we can go to the next slide. So in this hypothetical case, the team that I'm working with has decided to use an under the mattress sensor pad to monitor patient sleeping habits. And then the next thing to think about is once you've thought about all these different aspects from what is impactful to a patient, and then how you can translate that into something that's measurable and can be tied to an outcome, is to think about how you're going to actually implement and operationalize that. And so, and especially after you figured out which device or how you want to do the remote monitoring, what tools. And so who is responsible for purchasing the tool? Is it going to be someone at the provider organization, or is it going to be the patient themselves? Similar for who pays for it. And then how is the patient going to actually obtain that product is something else to think about. Again, is something you're going to be just giving to them, or do they have to go and obtain it on their own? And then is the patient going to have any difficulty setting up that device? And are there resources that are available to help them? Because we want to make sure that they set it up correctly, or else the utility could obviously be not as great. And then other things to think about too is there an informed consent process? And especially like thinking about in clinical scenarios, who's responsible in an event of an adverse event or an emergency. So in the case of sleep, we'd be concerned about perhaps like a prolonged apneic episode in the middle of the night that is captured by the device. Is the physician liable in that case, or or are they not? And how is that determined and understood by the patient prior to setting this up? And then there's other considerations that the individual physician might not be so familiar with, like cybersecurity considerations of these tools and cybersecurity informed consent. And then also considerations is going to be, how am I going to end up seeing the data from this this tool and this remote monitoring? This is something that can be integrated into the electronic health record. Is this something that the patient is going to show me on an app on their phone? Is it going to be raw data? Is it going to be aggregated? And how facile am I at interpreting that data and making a clinical decision based on it? So we can go to the next slide. And so I think there are a lot of potential upsides for doing this type of monitoring. It can be like very convenient for patients, it can be less invasive, and it can give you really actionable clinical information. But it's also important to think about the downsides to remote monitoring and potential harms. And it's an important part of the informed consent process. So there is risk of psychological harm from remote monitoring. There's just this piece in the New York Times about the sleep tracker that could make your insomnia worse. So you can imagine someone who's so invested in tracking their sleep that they almost become sort of obsessive about it, and they just keep checking the data and they keep checking the app on their phone to the point that it's actually preventing them from falling asleep. And there's a new word for this type of harm specifically in sleep called orthosomnia. But I've also seen it in patients. A patient I saw last week in clinic who has high blood pressure, and he's become He's been checking his blood pressure like up to 10 or 12 times a day, almost to the point that he gets worried about his blood pressure, gets so anxious, checks it, it's high. But then, if he lies down in his bed for 30 seconds and rechecks it, it's right back at a normal level. And so you can see how, there are possible downsides to remote monitoring. And we can go to the next slide. And then the other thing to consider is like, where is the data that you're collecting eventually going to go? And so, the data that we get from connected health technology can often move beyond the original place it's intended. It can influence algorithms that are used to determine health scores in terms of extra care that patients might receive. There's been some newer studies showing the downsides of some of these algorithms that can be biased for specific patients. And in my own personal clinical experience, I have seen how patients who are prescribed devices to help with sleep apnea will actually have them revoked by the companies that provide them if there's information the patient isn't adequately using it. So this already exists this is a technology that already exists, and I think something to be mindful of in this space. And I think that's my last slide, so I can turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Sophia. It's great to follow you, and it's a great lead into my focus. And so at Scripps Research, we have a focus on digital technology in enabling research, but a lot of our research is by design direct participant and designed to be pragmatic, so that it's when we think of research, sometimes think of it as very one-off from practice, and that's what we're trying to change using digital technology. But that's given us a lot of experience in incorporating different sensor technologies or other digital technologies within research. And what I'll kind of want to start with talking about it is just the concept that I think we all realize, but often don't take into account when we think about using this in clinical care, is that no matter how fancy your sensor is or how wonderful it is people don't use it. It's as good as nothing. It's not going to be helpful. It's not going to give you what you need. It's not going to give the participant, and then actually could have a negative effect and really kind of lead to disengagement. And too often we've seen where we have a great sensor that might be exactly what we need, but then we expect we don't create a good user experience so that the individuals who we need and want to use it, we just blindly assume that they're going to go ahead and do it and do everything we need to do without really going back and giving them value. And that's what I'll talk about. And go, the next slide is somewhat of one example we had from our trial. We always say that we often feel we've made more mistakes than most in implementing digital technologies. And this is one example. We did a large AFib screening trial, and we had a small sub-study of a wearable watch, which now is very commonplace. It was a wearable activity tracking device that 6 years ago, when we were designing the trial, was the only one that really monitored PPG-based heart rate. And it was a very nice device that it was incorporated in part of the mSToPS trial, which was based around using an ECG patch to monitor for AFib. It was only a small subgroup of 250 individuals who very enthusiastically signed up, even though the average age of our participants was 72. These are the subset people volunteered for it. Well, as it turned out, half the people never even activated the device after it was sent to them. So just the kind of and it's entirely our fault, not the participants' fault. We just kind of sent it and assumed they would, easily link it to their phone, that they would do all the upgrades and downloads that they had to do. And so it turns out only half the people ever did that. And this, again, was a device given for free. And then of people who used it, it turned out only about 15% who ever activated it continued to use it for the full 4-month period of time that we were asking them to use it. And I say full, there was a lot of variability in that. There were a very small percentage of people that wore it every day. And this is not a one-off experience. There was a really nice paper a year ago in Nature Partner Journal Digital Medicine that looked at the first 8 research kit app studies that got a lot of publicity about all the very fast sign up and how great it was. But the median duration of engagement in those 8 studies was 5 days. So that studies that were really designed to be long-term studies, half the population was done using it by 5 days. So obviously we have a lot of work to do. Next slide, please. So there are multiple challenges to overcome when we think about in clinical care and clinical research of keeping people engaged in the program. And one big part of that is trust. And I think trust in our healthcare and trust in the healthcare system is something we take for granted, and in a way because we have that when we think of the kind of the brick and mortar research facility or the brick and mortar facility of care, where you have the episodes of care and the one-off. There was a great editorial several years ago that kind of explained that there's almost, we have this Stockholm-like syndrome relationship with our patients, where our patients come in and they're afraid to make their doctor angry, or they're afraid to annoy their healthcare system. So if we ask them, will you participate in this trial? Will you wear this sensor? Will you measure your blood pressure? Those, yes, obviously I'll do this. Part of that is based on trust. Part of it is also, again, I trust the healthcare system. I trust my doctor. But a lot of it is also based on fear, for lack of a better word. And when you think about it, when we do things in a remote way, when we try to incorporate digital technologies direct to individuals, getting away from that episodes of care and brick and mortar facility setup, that we lose that inherent trust that is often there. And as we mature into using digital technologies in a more real world way, we have to get beyond what we have now, which is often with users signing end user license agreements blindly, just zipping down to the end of the agreement and hitting accept, because we've had more and more examples of data being inappropriately shared, as Sophia touched on. And if we're going to be serious about this and provide real care, that's a problem that we have to overcome. And then last on this slide, and one of the key things to lead into, is the equity of using digital technologies that we take for granted. A lot of the people who are by default on this call, who designed these devices, for many of us, this is just part of our natural daily lives to look at our phones. But for a lot, and particularly for the people that were most important, that have been left out of good healthcare or the high quality healthcare we want for everybody, or being involved in clinical research, we're excluding those. And you go to the next slide. And this highlights that problem. And I think that's been especially brought out in the current COVID pandemic that has affected the typically underrepresented in clinical research, the undercared for populations across the US and beyond the US. And there are many studies, and in fact, one run by Scripps that is all built around a bring your own device. So for people who already have a Fitbit, or people who already have an Apple Watch or other technologies. And while that's a very growing number of individuals, it's still far from, there's still a digital divide that's there. And one example we have is we're fortunate to be part of the All of Us research program that has a bring your own device aspect with Fitbit devices now. And we find that the All of Us research program is really designed to overcome a lot of the problems we've had with prior research, with the lack of diversity, with the lack of the historically underrepresented, and has done a wonderful job recruiting those individuals. But then when we look to the bring your own device population, it is more commonly a higher socioeconomic class, more often a white population, and that's something that we have to be aware of and address as to make sure that we bring equity with and equality in every aspect of what we do in healthcare. Next slide. and this highlights, just builds on that, the greatest divide, often see in the socioeconomic, there's also an age divide and an education divide as to people who inherently have broadband internet, who have a smartphone. And again, this is a large population, so this is not a reason not to use these technologies. So 80% of the US population has a smartphone, and that's great. But you know, and 20% have wearables, but they tend to skew towards the populations that have access to other healthcare. And I also, you know, it's not that digital technology alone has this problem. Our current healthcare systems, we often fail the 19% of the US population that lives in remote areas. Certainly in clinical research, one of the main criteria of being involved in a clinical trial is living close to an academic medical center. And the vast majority of the US population doesn't. So it's not an all good or bad, but we just have to be aware as we bring this out into clinical care and clinical research, that there is this divide and it has to be addressed to accomplish really what all of us want to accomplish. And next slide, please. So the next major point I want to cover as we think about using digital technologies in clinical care is, I would say, 98% of the startups or groups that we work with around using digital technologies in healthcare, the question they ask themselves is, how do we incorporate X, whatever our device is or technology is, within existing systems of care? And I believe, and our group believes, that this is a flawed approach. The existing systems of care are not made to incorporate these technologies. And so too often a personalized sensor device is kind of deployed with the assumption is, and then the physicians or a nurse or somebody in the office can just go ahead and look at this data, you know, whether it be 24 hours of something continuous or, you know, intermittent blood pressures or glucoses. Those are existing systems of care don't allow that. And there's a very nice analogy that would take too long to explain about the transition from steam engines to electricity in manufacturing. And it really, the productivity didn't increase with electricity until manufacturing changed to take advantage of what electricity allowed in the manufacturing process. And we believe it's the same in digital care. And so we have to get away from the thinking that we have our current existing system of care, now we're just going to add some digital technology into it. For the most part, that gives very tiny incremental benefits and doesn't really provide the transformational care that we really need. You know, next slide. So the real, I like the pro tip, and Jen put a lot of pressure saying I would say something insightful. So that, you know, that I think this just highlights that point that that we can't assume that integrating remote monitoring existing workflows is optimal. In fact, I would say you can assume the exact opposite based on our experience. And if you go to the next slide, I'll try to kind of emphasize that. So I have, you know, as a healthcare provider and working with a lot of healthcare providers in different, in bringing different technologies to bear, I always come back to one of my favorite quotes by our head of ambulatory care at Scripps Health, who every time we talk about some novel new technology we want to incorporate, he'd say, Steve, and remember, I and my doctors don't have a spare second during the day. And I think that's really true. And I think people outside of healthcare can appreciate that. Say, oh, come on, you always have a spare 30 seconds. Or say, well, you know, studies show that most doctors are going home and spending an hour with electronic health records catching up. So if you've got some new technology that says, oh, it'll just take 30 seconds for you to look at, and the developers kind of think, oh, that's no big deal. Well, that is a huge deal. And if you start telling primary care doctors, expecting primary care physicians or specialists or even people in their clinics to kind of take advantage of a fancy new widget or technology that you're monitoring, and they just expect them to kind of find time to do that, That's not possible unless that time is coming from something else, unless your fix is kind of giving them back more time in some other way. Next slide. So that's kind of, you know, when we do that, we have to bring value to the practitioner, but I think it's really also, you have to bring value to the participant and the user and the patient. And I think we often have skewed thinking as to what that is. So I'll go back to another kind of anecdote from when I was a first year out of training at a patient who was a young diabetic patient, and I was getting all on his case for not measuring his blood sugar enough. And he said, every time I measure my blood sugar, it reminds me I'm sick, and I don't like being reminded I'm sick. And every time we ask patients to do anything, fill out a survey, take their blood pressure, measure their glucose, you know, report anything to us, for many of our patients, that's a reminder to them that they are sick, that they're not the healthy person they want to be. And so we give people these technologies with the expectation that they're just going to measure their blood pressure every day or every other day or once a week, and they're going to share that with us, and they're going to be happy to do it because they know they have hypertension and they know that you're intending to do well. And that just, it doesn't work. And we have many examples. It works in some, and I always say there's like this 10% rule. There always seems to be 10% of whether it's a study or a clinical care where 10% of the people are committed and will stick with it, but we're missing on 90% of the individuals. And we have to realize that, and the solution, there's not one solution that fits every single individual. Some individuals will want that, you know, will want the daily blood pressure, they'll want feedback on it. Other people will want information only when it's actionable. And we have to be able to create solutions that can be as individualized as possible. Next slide. There's a lot of, as I mentioned, that COVID has opened up a lot of eyes and done a lot to help not only providers and patients, but maybe more importantly, payers and novel healthcare providers, the Amazon Cares, the CVS Health, the Walmarts, to look at things completely differently and remove patient monitoring. As the slide highlights, these changes remain temporary, but hopefully they're going to continue on. We in Alaska, we already did a lot of telehealth, did a lot more telehealth early in the COVID period, do more in general, but it's a reminder to most physicians who have never done telehealth before, it's just a poor version of an episode of care. It's not really taking full advantage of digital technologies. And so but it's opened the door to individuals seeing what's possible. If you go to the next, and I believe my final slide, and just what Sophia and I covered on is just a small amount of information that's available within the playbook and around clinical care. So I encourage everybody to take a look at find the areas that are most important to you, looking at whether it's be reimbursement and different communication aspects and clinical workflows. Jen, I think to you.
Fantastic. Sophia and Steve, that was a tremendous overview of I think some of the most important elements around introducing sort of remote monitoring into clinical care. And I will pause for a second and say, yes, you are both very good sports. I was definitely doing some arm twisting around being insightful, and you were also very gracious around using the slides within the playbook are sort of associated with you. I know that I definitely caused some toe curling with asking you to present slides with your own pictures on them. So we'll throw it open to questions. I have a laundry list of my own, and I can actually see, Lays, you made some really lovely comments. I'll unmute you at my end for a second in case you want to. If you unmute your phone or your computer, you should be able to make some remarks directly. And if you're not in a good spot, I will voice them for you.
Hi there, thank you. This is Lachey from Scripps Research, working with Steve, and I really appreciate this presentation a lot. And I really, truly appreciate the comments that Steve made about how, you know, when we look at brick and mortar research, we do rely on that trust that the participant has with their healthcare provider. And the comment I made via the chat was that, you know, when you work with marginalized and minoritized populations, you already start at a deficit because this population, because of historical things, don't have that inherent trust within the healthcare system and a lot of the healthcare providers. So doing even brick and mortar research with this population is challenging because you don't have that trust. And then you compound that trust issue when you try to do a remote monitoring and try to engage them when you don't, it's a blind person. I think even with some of the projects that we have right here at Scripps, when we try to engage people to link their electronic health data, when you look at minority populations, they're less likely to do that because of that inherent lack of trust. And so it compounds the issue, and it's looking at creative ways to see how we can engage them, because as Steve mentioned, I mean, COVID really did unmask a lot of the disparities that we see, and remote monitoring can be really helpful, but it's the question of how do we engage this population who are high risk, but are less likely to engage in this type of research.
And Lachey knows more about this than anybody, and she probably could have talked to my slides much better than I could have, and she's a young superstar in this. But that's, you know, this the trust aspect that she highlights, and especially in populations that have every reason not to have trust. And there is really one of the key hurdles to overcome to be successful with this. And I think, because I believe that when we do this the right way, we can provide healthcare. We can actually keep people healthy, as opposed to do what we are better at now, which is providing sickness care. If we do that and we democratize that and make it available to truly everybody on an equal footing, it's still, we have a lot of trust barriers to overcome. That in the long run will build more trust with the right group that does it the right way.
Fantastic. And oh, sorry, Lachey, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say thanks for that response, Steve. I appreciate that.
Terrific, and I'm glad you brought it up. I see we have another question that's come into the Q&A. Claire, let me go ahead and unmute you so you can pose your questions directly to Sophia and Steve. While they do that, I want to see if I'm going to perhaps be a precursor to Claire's question. Thinking about the trust element, and actually, Sophia, you brought up some issues around, you know, the risk of bias potentially. How do we prepare clinical decision makers? You know, Steve, you're right, there is no spare time in the day. How do we support sort of practitioners who are looking to make decisions about what to incorporate or not, in being able to identify sort of what good looks like among the very, very many sort of products that are available to them and their patients right now?
Yeah, I think thinking of the topic of like MD readiness, I think, you know, one thing I've been saying for a long time is like, which Steve already alluded to, is I don't think any physician just wants like reams of unfiltered data. They don't have the time in their day to spend looking at that. So I think the key thing is, how do you get the actionable information to the physician so that they can make an informed clinical decision that's relevant to their patient? Whether that is looking at their glucose levels or their blood pressure, and developing workflows around that. So I think in terms of scoping these different opportunities appropriately is really important, so that you can focus on what matters to the patient and then what's clinically actionable, and not just everything. Nobody wants to be like drinking out of a fire hose of digital information. But I'll pass off to Steve.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. And honestly, you know, in a fee-for-service environment, I don't see any easy path to incorporate digital technologies into our care, or in a meaningful way. You know, there are those that have found ways to incorporate it where it's in addition to what's already done, and that's being done purely to increase the ability to bill, which is kind of, I think, the exact opposite of what everybody's truly trying to do. And so that's what, for me, I have a very hard time, and we've tried for the 7.5 years I've been at Scripps and Director of Digital Medicine of working within healthcare systems have proven to be a near impossible burden to do anything that's truly innovative and broad, because of the things we're trying to do, we don't get reimbursed for. So I'll give an example. In Alaska, we're trying to incorporate a remote echocardiography program where we have teleguided echo using smartphone-based echocardiogram. A great idea for everybody. We have patients who have to fly into Anchorage to get echocardiograms now, but our healthcare system loses money by doing this. And so we just happen to have a lot of really good, motivated care providers, and hopefully we have none of the administration from our system listening to this call. But we're kind of doing it on the sly, and realizing it's good for everybody, but it's not good for our bottom line.
Fantastic. That's really interesting, almost sort of disincentive there. Claire, I'll hand over to you, and you should be able to pause for, let me see. Yeah, Claire, you're up. I'm sorry, that was my fault.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Great discussion here, and definitely a part of it. Having spent so much time on the research of developing the digital measures, this is a part of it that's definitely newer to me, but I think so important, which is kind of the last mile piece of this, right? Which is, once we develop the measures, like, will they actually be adopted, right? And having a brother who's an ER doc in New Orleans, Louisiana, where people walk in with their Apple Watches, having had an alert go off, and he is just so frustrated by, like, what am I supposed to do with that? They're not having an irregular heartbeat in that moment. And there's no sort of clinical guidance, right, for what I do with that. I'm just wondering, you know, I know there are lots of, especially academic medical centers and kind of researchers who have an increased interest in this and are sort of convinced of the value of sort of digital and the opportunity it presents to better know what's going on between your clinical interactions. But it would be great to just hear a little bit more about, like, how widespread is that appetite for digital measures? And if it's not as widespread as it should be, like, what tracks should we be laying now to say, like, this is coming? Like, I'm thinking of everything from, like, CME courses. Like, is this being integrated into cardiology CME courses, to primary care CME courses, to sort of begin to show people what's possible? And then I guess in institutions where you guys have integrated sort of digital medicine more broadly, like, how are you overcoming this with maybe, I hate to be ageist, but older physicians who are like, nah, I'm just going to keep it the way that I've been doing it, but to sort of try and change that tide, I guess, with people who are you know, naysayers and not the early adopters.
So I'll start, because I think it's a great question, and I think I like the way you started the question. You're talking about the last mile, and I think that's one of the problems. Is a lot of these technologies are developed because, oh, we can do this, and it starts with, this is what we can do, and instead I would, as say, everybody should start with, what's the problem we're trying to solve? So it should be almost the first mile, or at least very close to the first mile, after we got this great technology. Okay, how can that be used to solve a problem? And too often it isn't the problem that comes in. To your other point of how do you successfully do this? So I always give two examples. There's a study done, it was published in the late 1999, that looked at after you have a definitive paper that shows some effective therapy is effective, how long does it take until that therapy is used in half of the individuals? And it's 17 years was the half-life for that. And it's essentially a generational change. And I'll even give a better example, because again, I think people outside of healthcare have a hard time understanding that. I'm a cardiologist. In 1987, the ISIS-2 trial showed that giving just 2 baby aspirins in the setting of a heart attack saved lives. So you've got aspirin, very inexpensive, 2 aspirins, truly save lives, decrease mortality by 25% in this study, in a very large study, unquestioned. So this, no safety issues because it's just aspirin. 10 years later in the United States, 1/3 of all individuals being admitted for a heart attack into US hospitals were not getting aspirin within the first 24 hours. And there is no logical explanation for that. And it goes back to, it isn't just older physicians. I think for a lot of physicians, once they get out of training, they get into a system where practice is so time consuming, there isn't the luxury to sit back and say, how can I be doing this better? What can we do? And doing that, an individual will always kind of gradually change things as they read papers and do stuff. But for a lot of these things we're talking about, it's really, creating a system that does that. And within those few systems that I'm aware of that have incorporated digital technologies, it's really requires a single champion who's in a leadership position, who can get it done, who is just passionate about it, for it able to happen. And that's why one reason we have a lot of one-off examples of using digital technologies and less, at least personalized digital technologies, and less of system-wide success stories, I think.
Yeah, so Claire, I heard you mention like 3 big themes. So one was incentives, like how can we incentivize the broader dissemination of these tools? The second was integration, and the third was educating providers. So, and I know like Steve tackled a little bit more of the latter two, but I think in the incentives piece, I do think that being in more value-based arrangements in terms of payment structures definitely does go towards incentivizing like this remote patient monitoring clinical settings. So, and I think, we're still like in early stages of a lot of that, but I think that is where there really is an opportunity. There's an opportunity for cost savings. There's an opportunity for example, like if I'm measuring someone's blood pressure and having them come in for nurse office visits and they're not coming in and they're not well controlled in their blood pressure, and if there's a quality outcome that's tied to that too, then you can see there is a pretty clear incentive for me to think about how could I be checking, monitoring their blood pressure remotely, making medication changes based on that information, and then getting my patient to a goal that is meaningful to them for their long-term health outcomes. So I think that's really where where I see the incentives moving from the provider side. And then I think, the integration piece is challenging. And I think just like thinking as big picture, why I think it's a lot of the EMRs just have very poor user interface at baseline. So the idea from like, if you ask any provider, like, would you like another XYZ added to your EMR? The answer would probably be no. I think we'd like a lot of things removed. So I think that's also where it gets tricky in terms of thinking about like adding something to, as Steve has already alluded to, a very imperfect workflow. And then around education, I'm not aware of a lot of opportunities, like in terms of CME and stuff like that, that are sort of broadly available. I think that will be also changing, but I think that's also a reflection of the lack of sort of like systematic way that this is being deployed in clinical care. And I think if that changes and this becomes something that's more widely disseminated, then my assumption is that the sort of education piece will follow.
Yeah, and just one more quick follow-up to that. I mean, like, is this being integrated into like medical school and residencies, right? Because it seems like those physicians, like by the time they're practicing, this is at least going to be a small corner of their world, if not an increasing corner.
I'll just say, as someone who recently finished residency, in my experience, the answer was no. There's a lot to do in residency, just taking care of patients. And I think there's a lot of things that would be useful to learn more about, including this topic. Even just like how to bill for patient care isn't something that you learn much about in residency, which becomes like very applicable once you finish. So, but I think that will also change, but it might be more on a program by program basis.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of the kind of the older academic, prestigious medical centers are the most old school in many ways of keeping things the way they were, and are again, there may always be pockets, but there's challenges in a fee-for-service environment for that to happen. med schools, I think, are being more aggressively trying to approach that. And med school has always been, unfortunately, kind of based on, there's a certain weakness about looking things up, and med schools are starting to change, of realizing that medicine has become so complicated that no single human being can remember everything they have to. And I was told our fellows that there are 50,000 new peer-reviewed publications every single week. You can't even pretend that you're going to stay up on things as you do it. And so med schools are starting to incorporate, biomedical engineering aspects to better understand artificial intelligence, using technologies in ways, in multiple ways, where I believe it has to be used in order to improve care. But then if it doesn't happen during residency or your fellowship afterwards, then that's what really trains you as to how you're going to practice, I think, for the majority of your career. And as Sophia notes, it's not typically incorporated.
Fantastic, Claire, great questions. You drew out some really terrific discussion, as always. Komathi, I've unmuted you from my side. You should be able to unmute yourself and pose your question to Steve and Sophia.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for hosting this. And thank you, Sophia and Steve. Really thought-provoking presentation. I have been thinking a lot about how do we leverage remote care in chronic conditions. And in chronic conditions, you're kind of shifting out of, by using all this digital technology, the concept of, hey, 15 minutes before the clinician walks into the exam room for the visit, they look at the chart and then they go in and they're talking to the patient. But now you might have reams of data from the last visit that they came in for maybe 3 months ago to now, if you're daily tracking all of this data. So any thoughts or comments on how we manage that cognitive overload of so much data, ever increasing data being generated by the patients in between clinic visits? And then also, how do we put it into the workflow of the very static EHR system in a way that they can absorb it in that 15 minutes before they go in to talk to the patient? So any thoughts or solutions that you think we should think about when addressing that?
Well, if you don't mind, Sophia, I'll start, because I think you bring up one of the real problems even as we think about this. So as you're thinking about this and the way you frame your questions, it's all around episodes of care. And episodes of care are extraordinarily artificial, at least for me. When I see a patient and I say, okay, I'll follow you up in 3 months, is that better than 4 months? Is it worse than 2 months? I don't know. I just made up 3 months at that time because that seemed good. And I have no idea what happened in between those things. If we're going to do daily monitoring, we have to think about it in a meaningful way. We have to think about it as not just something that builds up to getting a summary right at the time of that next episode of care, but rather something that is tracked. Now, tracked not necessarily by a human. And I always, you can answer everything, I think, if you throw in artificial intelligence or machine learning, or maybe throw in a gamification, and then that suddenly solves every digital medicine problem. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but there are ways where we can, identify, individual important changes that leads to an alert. But again, I think it starts with thinking about, how do we actually create new systems of care that isn't built around these episodes of care. And I'll be the first to admit that makes this very, very difficult, because that's the opposite of what every healthcare system does. But I think, in my mind, one of the great examples of success of patient care is Livongo, who did hypertension and glucose management, really not, and they built it around the user. They didn't build it around the doctor's episodes of care. And so I'm glad that they've had some success, and I hopefully it can be a model for the future. So that's kind of a non-answer to your question. I'm sorry. Now I'll let Sophia actually answer it.
No, I mean, I agree with Steve. I think the best possible way of using this data is like a future state that I don't think we have right now, at least I haven't seen, which is, you want, again, it's like, what information do you need to make that is clinically relevant to you or the patient where you can act on it? So like if your patient's checking their blood pressure all the time and they're on a stable blood pressure regimen and they're in a good range, then you probably never really need to know about it, or you want to give them like a high five, congrats, for, you know, like to reinforce some positive feedback, right? But if their blood pressure is like persistently elevated, or they haven't checked it in a week, then you're going to want to do something about that. So I think, and again, like not all of this has to bubble up to the level of the physician. So I do think there's like some future state workflows that we need to think about for this that are different than how we're taking care of patients now. And we should think really hard about, as a broader community, about what we want those to look like, so that we can give the best care to patients and not limit ourselves to what we're doing right now.
Thank you. No, I completely agree with you guys on shifting from episodic care to continuous care, and how do we do that with new roles in the community. I'm curious with the EHR integration, is that working with digital data? I mean, what seems to be working and what isn't in that space?
I don't know. I don't have a good example of anything that's working. I know there was an interesting study out of Cedars-Sinai several years ago that allowed patients to share their activity monitor data in the EHR record. And I don't remember exactly, but it was a low single-digit number of people who chose to do that. And part of that is just, probably there weren't any physicians knocking down the doors with their patients saying, please share that data with me, I want to do something. And because of that, there just wasn't that interest there. So I don't know. I don't have a good example. Sophia, maybe you do.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately not sure I have great examples either. I mean, there are some connectivities that you can do with like EMRs and Apple, or just even like self-reported data, but that is not that sophisticated. So I think we're still like, I think probably, I would assume more to come, but I haven't seen anything like fabulous on my end as a provider.
Great, thank you.
Comathy, great questions. Thank you so much. Sally, I've unmuted you to pose a quick fire question to Steve before we sign off at the top of the hour. Are you able to unmute yourself? We've got you.
Yes, okay, you got me, thanks. Okay, great. Hi, Steve. Hi, Sophia.
Hey, Sally.
Great talk. I was going to pose the question to you, Steve. That's you mentioned before about 10% of people actually use the tools that they're given. So about 90% of them aren't. I'm wondering, at what point, is there a tipping point at which the return on investment for this kind of resources and time we might be able to be targeting for engagement on use of these tools, where we might actually start to see some return on not only better outcomes, but the investment in time and of clinicians' time and people's resources?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to. I mean, otherwise, we have to be able to find that tipping point. But I think more importantly, we have to find, because I would guess, don't know, that the 10% of the people that are using it are the people where it already reinforces good information to them. So let's say we're talking about continuous blood pressure monitoring, the people whose blood pressure is continuously high are going to stop. The people who are like feeling good, like, hey, I'm great, and being reminded of it, are more likely to continue. So the key of the engagement part of it, and I think, again, too often we think just giving somebody a device is engaging, and that probably is for a week. But by giving somebody new technology to try out, but to really we have to be successful, we have to find a way to make it engaging. And that, to me, is like everything. If we want engaging, means how do you make it valuable to the person? So if every day I have a limited amount of time and energy and mental energy to focus on something, how do I want to make sure that my patient puts on this watch or does this device or does whatever it is? What is it that's going to bring that, be a continuous reminder to that individual? It's like, oh, if I don't, I'm going to miss this, or I'm going to, be disappointed I don't know this. And that's the way we have to think about this. And we too often don't.
Seems like we have a long road ahead with it, but we'll
Agreed.
stay on it.
Yes. Thanks,
We will keep working together, Sally. That is the perfect way to round this out. Everyone on the line, thank you for joining us this afternoon and for some tremendous questions. This was incredibly valuable. Sophia, Steve, this was a terrific session. Thank you for not only some wonderful sort of remarks drawing on the playbook, but also some really sort of thoughtful responses to a great discussion. I want to make sure I let everyone go on time. Just a quick heads up. Next week, we have the last in our fall Playbook Masterclass series, and we will have Katie Backer-Motes and Ed Ramos, also from Scripps, coming to talk about the use of remote monitoring specifically in public health. So it will build on this session tremendously well. Steve, Sophia, thanks again. I hope many of you can join us next week, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.